"Hey, you there, cleaning? How about a quick demonstration?" The voice, sharp and loud, sliced through the humid air of the martial arts gym. It was a voice accustomed to being the center of attention, a voice that reveled in its own authority. It belonged to Derek Mitchell, and it was aimed like a weapon at the man quietly mopping the floor in the far corner. Derek stood in the center of the main mat, a black belt tied neatly around the waist of his crisp, white GI gleaming under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent light. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, right?" James Washington stopped mopping. He didn't look up immediately. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the familiar, cloying scent of sweat and disinfectant filling his lungs. At 42, he had been working as the janitor at the Mitchell Modern Martial Arts Academy for only 3 weeks. It was a simple job, a quiet job, and that's all he wanted. He always arrived after hours, a ghost who moved through the empty space, cleaning up the aftermath of the day's exertions, long after the students had gone home. But on this particular Thursday night, the advanced class training had run late, bleeding into his designated time, forcing this unwelcome intersection of his present and his past. He slowly looked up, his eyes calm and weary, meeting the "I don't want to bother you, Sensei," James replied, his voice a low, quiet rumble that was easily absorbed by the vast high-ceilinged room. He returned his attention to a stubborn, black scuff mark on the polished wooden floor. "Just finishing up here so you can get back to it." Derek let out a loud, theatrical laugh that echoed through the gym. It was a performance, and he was playing to his audience. "Everyone, look at this," he bellowed, gesturing dramatically towards James. The guy's afraid to even step on the mat. The 8 students present, all of them wearing the colored belts of various intermediate and advanced ranks, laughed nervously. Some of them, James noted, looked visibly uncomfortable with their instructor's behavior. They were here to learn, to fight, to build discipline. But this felt like something else entirely. This felt like bullying. What Derek Mitchell, in his kingdom of canvas and sweat, didn't know, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that James Washington had spent the last 20 years of his life trying with every fiber of his being to completely and utterly forget who he really was. 20 years since he had walked away from the roar of the crowd, the blinding glare of the spotlights, the brutal, beautiful violence of the ring. 20 years since the accident that had shattered his life, his soul, forever. 20 long, quiet, anonymous years of keeping a secret so profound, so heavy, that not even his own teenage daughter knew the full, terrible truth of it. "Come on, man," Derek continued, his voice dripping with a condescending false bonhomie. He began to walk towards James, his movements a confident, arrogant swagger. He was the king of this small castle, and he was about to make sport of a peasant. "Just a little demonstration. I bet you don't even know how to do a basic guard." He stopped just a few feet from James, his shadow falling over the janitor's stooped form. "How about you help me show my students the difference between someone who trains and someone who just cleans?" James felt that familiar old sensation in the deep muscles of his chest and back. It was like a dormant, sleeping muscle being prodded, being awakened after years of deliberate inactivity. His eyes met Derek's briefly, and for a split, almost imperceptible second, something passed between them, a flicker of something ancient, something dangerous. It was a look that made the instructor, for the first time, take a tiny, involuntary step back. "Just an educational demonstration," Derek insisted, his voice now a little louder, a little more insistent, as if he were trying to hide the sudden, inexplicable uncertainty he felt. "Nothing too serious. Just to show the beginners why it's so important to respect the martial art, to respect the hierarchy." James placed the mop carefully into the yellow bucket on the floor. He stood up slowly, his movements possessing a strange, fluid economy that was utterly at odds with the shuffling, weary posture of a man who had supposedly never stepped on a tatami mat before. Around the gym, the students who had been half-heartedly practicing their katas now stopped completely, their attention drawn to the silent, unfolding drama. They sensed, with the primal instinct of all predators and prey, that something was about to happen. "All right," James said finally, his voice as calm and as still as the surface of a deep lake just before a storm. "But when we're done, you're going to apologize. To all of them." He nodded his head towards the students. "For turning this mat, this dojo, into a circus." Derek laughed again, but this time, the sound was a little forced, a little brittle. "Apologize, man. You're going to be the one apologizing to the floor when you meet it, face first." What none of those people in that room knew, what the arrogant, preening sensei could never have guessed, was that the quiet, unassuming janitor before them had once been known to the world by another name. A name that had been chanted by thousands in packed arenas from Las Vegas to Tokyo. A name that had been synonymous with a level of technical brilliance and controlled, devastating power that the world of mixed martial arts had rarely seen before or since. James Silent Storm Washington, 5-time, undefeated, undisputed, world mixed martial arts champion. He had retired at the absolute height of his career, a ghost who had vanished from the sport, leaving behind only questions and legends. He had retired after an accident, a tragic, stupid, sparring accident that had cost the life of his best friend, his brother-in-arms, his main training partner, and since that day he had sworn a silent, solemn vow to himself, a vow made in the sterile, quiet grief of a hospital waiting room. He had sworn that he would never fight again. But some promises, he was now beginning to realize, are made to be broken, especially when a man's dignity is at stake. Derek adjusted his black belt with another theatrical, self-important gesture, clearly savoring every second of the attention that was now focused entirely on him. "Everyone, gather round," he commanded, his voice booming with a renewed, if slightly forced, confidence. "You are all about to see a practical, real-world demonstration of why there is a hierarchy in the world of martial arts, why some of us lead, and some of us follow." James watched as the 8 students, their faces a mixture of apprehension and a reluctant, morbid curiosity, formed a loose semicircle around the main mat. Some of them, the younger, more impressionable ones, seemed eager for the demonstration, their eyes wide with the anticipation of a spectacle. Others, particularly a young Asian woman with her dark hair tied back in a severe, practical bun, looked visibly uncomfortable, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She muttered something under her breath to the classmate standing next to her, a lanky, red-headed boy who just shook his head in a gesture of silent, resigned disapproval. "Look, everyone," Derek continued, his voice now taking on the tone of a lecturer, a professor of condescension. He gestured dramatically towards James, who was now taking off his worn steel-toed work boots. "Here we have a perfect textbook example of someone who has never understood that there are appropriate places for certain types of people, elite gyms, places of higher learning. They are not for, well, you know, the unspoken words, the ugly, racist, classist implications, hung in the air like a foul, toxic smoke." James felt that familiar old twinge in his chest again, a sharp, painful echo from a past he had tried so hard to bury. It was the same feeling he had had 20 years ago, in the locker rooms, in the press conferences, when he would hear the same kinds of comments, the same kinds of whispers, about fighters who didn't look like the traditional, marketable champions. The difference was that now, at 42, he had learned, through years of painful, solitary introspection, to turn that raw hot anger into fuel for something much more powerful, much more controlled, than a simple punch. "Sensei Derek," the young Asian woman interrupted, her voice timid but clear. "Maybe we could just continue our normal training. It's getting late." "And what's your name again?" Derek asked, his tone sharp, dismissive. Sarah Chen, Sensei." "Well, Sarah Chen," Derek said, his voice now dripping, with a cold, menacing sarcasm, deliberately using her full name as a clear, public demonstration of his authority over her. "Are you questioning my teaching methodology? Is that what you're doing?" "No, Sensei, of course not," she stammered, her face flushing with a mixture of fear and embarrassment. "Then sit down and watch," Derek commanded, his voice a low growl. "You will learn more in the next 5 minutes about the reality of power dynamics than you will in a month of your conventional, textbook training." James watched the exchange, and he noticed a look of fear in Sarah Chen's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in his own mirror 2 decades ago, in the dark, sleepless nights after the accident, the nights when he would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the image of his friend, Tony Hammer Rodriguez, lying still and lifeless on the canvas, burned into the inside of his eyelids. Tony had died because of him. It was that simple, that brutal, that undeniable. A series of punches, thrown with an excessive, uncontrolled force during a routine sparring session. Tony had fallen, his head hitting the floor at a strange, unnatural angle, and he had never woken up. The official investigation, the coroner's report, had concluded that it was a tragic, 1-in-a-million accident, but James knew the truth. He had lost control. He had been fueled by the pressure of an upcoming title defense, and by the ugly, racist comments he had endured from the crowd, and from his opponent's corner, during his last fight. He had brought that poison, that rage, into the sparring ring with his best friend, and it had killed him. So, Janitor, Derek sneered, his attention returning to James, his voice full of a renewed, cruel confidence. How about you show my students how to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop? Laughter, this time more confident, more sycophantic, echoed around the gym. But James remained motionless. His eyes closed briefly, and for a long, silent moment, he was no longer in a small suburban martial arts gym. He was back in that sold-out smoke-filled arena in Las Vegas, 22 years ago, hearing the same kinds of comments, the same kinds of taunts that had preceded the tragedy that had so completely, so irrevocably, changed the course of his life. What's the matter? Are you scared? Derek insisted, his voice a low, goading taunt. He began to circle James now, his movements slow, predatory. Or are you just going to stand there, like a lamppost, like you do with that squeegee of yours all day long? And that was when Derek Mitchell made his first, and most fatal, mistake. He pushed James. It was a light push, a seemingly harmless, two-fingered shove to the shoulder, but it was a touch that was laden with all the arrogance, all the contempt, of a man who had never, in his entire, privileged, comfortable life, faced any real, meaningful consequences for his actions. James absorbed the push without moving an inch. His bare feet, which he had placed on the cool, smooth surface of the mat, remained planted on the ground as if they were the roots of an ancient oak tree. Derek, who had expected the janitor to stumble back, to flinch, felt as if he had just tried to push a solid, unyielding concrete wall. The instructor's arrogant, cruel smile faltered for a split second. A flicker of confusion, of surprise, crossed his face. Interesting, James muttered, his voice a low, quiet rumble, more to himself than to Derek. It's been a while since someone tried to provoke me like that. There was something in James's voice, a new, strange, and deeply unsettling quality, that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't anger. It was the frightening, preternatural calm of someone who had walked through much, much darker valleys, and had emerged, on the other side, transformed. Derek, unable to read, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, the clear and present danger signals, doubled down on his arrogance. Did you hear that, guys? He called out to his students, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. He thinks it's interesting. How about we show him the difference between thinking something is interesting, and knowing what it's like to be on the receiving end of a real, trained martial artist? What Derek, in his blindness, didn't realize, was that every humiliating word, every condescending gesture, was awakening something in James that had been dormant for 2 long, painful decades. It was not anger. It was not a thirst for revenge. It was something far more dangerous. It was the crystal-clear, ice-cold memory of who he really was. When he stopped hiding, Sarah Chen watched the scene with a growing sense of discomfort, but also with a new, professional fascination. There was something about the way the janitor was breathing, a slow, deep, diaphragmatic rhythm. There was something about the way his muscles, which she could see were incredibly well defined under his simple, grey t-shirt, tensed and relaxed. Almost imperceptibly, it reminded her of the documentaries she had watched on the Discovery Channel, about large, powerful predators. It was the calm before the attack. Last chance, buddy, Derek announced, his voice now clearly, openly irritated by James's continued, and deeply unsettling, lack of a fearful response. Either you accept this demonstration, like a man, or I will call security and have you escorted out of my gym. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. And guess what? You'll lose your job, too. James opened his eyes slowly, and when his gaze met Derek's, the instructor felt a genuine, primal chill run down his spine. It was as if he had just spent the last 10 minutes poking a sleeping dragon with a stick, and had just finally succeeded in waking it up. All right, James said finally, his voice low, but now laden with a quiet, profound authority that made everyone in that room, including Derek, fall instantly silent. But when we're done, I want you to explain to your students why you turned a place of learning a dojo into a circus of humiliation. Derek laughed, but this time, the sound was nervous, brittle, and completely unconvincing. Explain. Man, you're going to have a lot of explaining to do, when you're trying to remember your own name from the floor. What neither of them knew, what only James himself was beginning to remember, was that he had spent the last 20 years not only running from his past, but also, in his own quiet, solitary way, perfecting a level of emotional and physical control that had transformed his former destructive, youthful rage into something much more refined, much more focused, and much more devastatingly effective. Each new humiliation, each cruel, dismissive word, had only served to fuel a silent, cold strength within him, a cold, clear, and absolute determination that his former opponents in the ring had known and feared all too well. A determination that Derek Mitchell was about to discover in the worst, most public, and most painful way possible. Derek adjusted his posture, his confidence seemingly restored by his own bluster. He was, once again, the sensei, the master of his domain. His 8 students, now completely silent, formed a perfect, expectant circle around the mat. Some of them, James could see, were still eager for the spectacle, their faces alight with the vicarious thrill of a confrontation. Others, like the young, brave Sarah Chen, looked on with a mixture of apprehension and a new, dawning respect for the quiet man who had refused to be broken. Everyone, Derek announced theatrically, his arms extended like a showman presenting his main act. You are about to witness a lesson that is worth more than 6 months of your regular training. You are about to see, firsthand, the profound, unbridgeable difference between those of us who dedicate our entire lives to the noble art of martial arts, and those who just, well, clean the floor where real fighters walk. James stood motionless, in the center of the mat, but something fundamental had changed in his breathing, in his very presence. His eyes closed briefly, and for a long silent moment, he was no longer in a small suburban martial arts gym in Denver, Colorado. He was back at the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 long years ago. He was hearing the ugly, racist comments from the crowd just before his first world title fight against the formidable Russian champion Viktor the Demolition Man Petrov. Look at that little black guy, someone in the stands had shouted that distant, fateful night. I bet he won't last 3 rounds against a real, white, European fighter. James had won that fight by a brutal, technical knockout in the 2nd round. But the victory, he now knew, had cost him dearly. The poison of those racist comments, the immense pressure of representing an entire community on his young shoulders, had caused him to lose control in the sparring session that had followed, just a few days later. The sparring session that had resulted in the accidental and unforgivable death of his best friend, Tony Rodriguez. So, Janitor, Derek sneered, his voice pulling James back from the ghosts of his past. He was circling James now, his movements light, bouncy, a predator toying with its cornered prey. How about you show my students how not to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop? It was then that Sarah Chen, unable to remain a silent, passive observer any longer, took a step forward. Sarah, a 22-year-old purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and a master's student in sports psychology at the local university, had spent the last 2 years of her academic life documenting and analyzing cases of discrimination and abuse of power in sports for her thesis. What she was witnessing now was not just a case of simple bullying. It was a perfect textbook example of the kind of toxic, hierarchical abuse she had been studying. It was valuable academic material, but it was also deeply, personally, disturbing. Since Derek, she interrupted, her voice firm, clear, and respectful, but utterly devoid of the fear he expected. Can I ask you a question? Why, exactly, do you think it is necessary to humiliate someone who is just trying to do his job? The silence that followed her question was deafening. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Derek slowly, deliberately, turned to face her, his eyes narrowing into 2 small, dangerous slits. He was a king whose authority had just been, openly, publicly, challenged by one of his own subjects. Excuse me, Sarah, he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. But who, exactly, is teaching this class? You, or me? You are, Sensei, she replied calmly, her own posture now a mirror of James's quiet, unshakable confidence. But I was under the impression that the class was about martial arts, not about racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration. Several of the other students exchanged nervous, wide-eyed glances. No one, in the entire history of the Mitchell Modern Martial Arts Academy, had ever dared to confront Derek like this before. The instructor felt his face flush with a mixture of pure, unadulterated rage and a deep, public embarrassment. Racial, he sputtered, his voice a forced, incredulous laugh. This has nothing to do with race. This has to do with respect. Respect for the martial art, and knowing your place. James opened his eyes slowly. There was something in the way Sarah had spoken, in the quiet, profound courage of this young woman who was standing up to an established and clearly abusive authority figure, that reminded him, with a sudden, painful clarity, of his younger sister Kesha. Kesha had had that same fire, that same fierce, unyielding determination, that same absolute refusal to accept injustice silently. Kesha had died at the age of 17, the innocent, random victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation in her neighborhood. James had been in Japan, competing in a tournament, when he had received the devastating news. Another person, he loved another person he should have been there to protect, lost while he was off pursuing his own glory in distant, foreign rings. It was another reason, another heavy, iron weight, that had contributed to his decision to abandon everything, to disappear into the quiet, safe, and anonymous simplicity of a life lived in the shadows. Sarah, Derek said, his voice now a dangerously low, menacing whisper, if you cannot respect my teaching methods, then perhaps you should look for another gym. There are other, more sensitive places that might be more suited to people with your particular mentality. The threat, the clear, unmistakable threat of expulsion, hung in the air like a toxic, suffocating smoke. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. My tuition is paid for the year, Sensei, she replied, her voice unwavering, and I believe that everyone in this room deserves a learning environment that is based on mutual respect, not on public humiliation. And that was when James did something that no one, least of all Derek, expected. He started to smile. It wasn't a nervous smile. It wasn't a submissive smile. It was the slow, calm, calculated smile of a man who had just, finally, found a reason to stop hiding. For 20 long, painful, solitary years, he had carried the crushing weight of his guilt, the guilt for 2 deaths that had, in their own tragic, indirect ways, resulted from his involvement in the brutal, unforgiving world of professional fighting. Now, seeing this brave, intelligent young woman defending the very same principles of justice and honor that he had so completely, so shamefully, abandoned all those years ago, James Washington began to remember who he really was. Derek, James said finally, his voice now carrying a quiet, profound authority that made everyone in that room, from the most timid white belt to the arrogant sensei himself, turn to face him. The young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. This is about you. It's about you trying to feel important by making someone else feel small. Derek spun on his heels, his face a mask of pure, sputtering indignation. How dare you, he roared. How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is. James took a single, deliberate step forward, onto the main mat. And in that single, simple movement, something fundamental, something profound, changed in his posture. His shoulders, which had been slumped with the weary resignation of a man who had given up, now straightened. His center of gravity lowered, almost imperceptibly, and his bare feet, which he had placed on the cool, smooth canvas, positioned themselves in a stance that any experienced fighter in the world would have instantly recognized as perfect. Actually, James said calmly, his voice now a low, resonant rumble that seemed to fill the entire silent gym. I know exactly what a dojo is, and I know that this place stopped being one a long, long time ago. Derek felt an inexplicable, primal chill run down his spine. There was something about the way James was moving now, the way he was occupying the space, the sheer, unadulterated, and terrifying confidence that was radiating from him, that awakened all of his most basic, most primitive instincts for self-preservation. But his wounded, arrogant pride, the very thing that had gotten him into this situation in the first place, would not, could not, allow him to back down. Not now, not in front of his students. Enough talk, Derek growled, his voice a desperate, last-ditch attempt to reassert his dominance. He assumed his favorite fighting stance, a flashy, aggressive posture that was designed to intimidate. I'm going to teach you some respect, the hard way. Sarah watched the scene with a growing sense of apprehension, but also with a new, professional fascination she had, for her research, documented and analyzed hundreds of hours of sparring sessions and professional competitions, and something about the way the janitor was now moving, the absolute, perfect economy of his movements, the slow, controlled rhythm of his breathing, the profound, centered calmness that seemed to radiate from him like a contained, powerful energy, reminded her of the old, grainy, historical videos she had studied of the great legendary masters of the past. James closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment of darkness, he allowed 22 years of dormant, suppressed, muscle memory to resurface. Every technique he had ever perfected, every combination he had ever mastered, every victory he had ever won, every painful, brutal lesson he had ever learned in the most unforgiving rings in the world, all of it came flooding back. When he opened his eyes again, Derek Mitchell was no longer looking at a humble, unassuming janitor. He was looking directly into the cold, calm, and utterly terrifying eyes of Silent Storm Washington, the 5-time undefeated world mixed martial art champion. "Last chance to apologize, Derek," James offered, his voice now quiet, almost kind. "Apologize to her." He nodded towards Sarah. "Apologize to your students, and turn this place back into a space of learning, of respect." Derek laughed, but the sound that came out was nervous, brittle, and completely, utterly, unconvincing. "Apologize? Man, you'll be begging me for forgiveness when you're trying to breathe from the floor." What Derek, in his final, fatal act of arrogance, couldn't see was that James had already, in the space of a few short seconds, identified all of his technical and spiritual weaknesses, the high, tense guard that left his body completely exposed, the unstable, unbalanced tendency to retreat with his right leg first, the way he telegraphed his punches with a series of tiny, almost imperceptible micro-movements of his shoulder. 22 years away from the ring had not erased, had not even dulled, decades of a refined, almost supernatural, technical analysis. Sarah noticed that the other students were now instinctively backing away, widening the circle, like a herd of wild animals sensing the approach of an impending and violent storm. Something in the very energy of the room had completely and irrevocably changed. The air itself seemed to have become electrically charged, as if it were waiting for a sudden, brilliant, and devastating lightning strike. It was when everyone laughed, a final, nervous, sycophantic laugh at Derek's last, pathetic taunt, that something unexpected, something profound, began to take shape in James's expression. It was not anger, it was not a desire for revenge. It was the calm, centered, and absolute determination of a man who had finally, after 20 long, painful years, found a cause that was worthy of breaking his most sacred and most painful vow. Some of those present, the more perceptive, more intuitive ones, began to realize that something extraordinary, something historic, was about to happen, even without fully understanding what or who their eyes were truly witnessing. Derek assumed his favorite fighting stance, the one he had used to intimidate hundreds of beginners and to win a handful of local insignificant tournaments over the years. His feet were shoulder-width apart, his fists clenched at chest level, his weight shifted slightly forward onto the balls of his feet. It was the classic, by-the-book stance of a man who had learned the art of fighting in the safe, controlled, and predictable environment of a gym, against opponents who followed the same rules, the same conventions, that he did. James, in contrast, stood motionless for a few long, silent seconds, simply observing. His eyes, calm and analytical, scanned Derek from head to toe, his brain, a supercomputer of combat analysis, automatically cataloging every single technical detail. He saw the high, tense guard that left Derek's ribs and solar plexus completely, almost comically, exposed. He saw the unstable, narrow base that severely compromised his balance, making him vulnerable to a simple trip or a well-timed push. He saw the excessive nervous tension in his shoulders, a tension that would not only drain his stamina, but that also telegraphed every single move he was about to make, a fraction of a second before he even began to make it. Still waiting, Derek sneered, hopping slightly on his feet, a nervous, wasted expenditure of energy. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost all night?" And that was when James did something that no one, least of all Derek, expected. He started to move. It wasn't a dramatic, aggressive change. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible repositioning of his body. His feet widened slightly, his center of gravity lowered, his shoulders relaxed into a perfectly horizontal and deceptively passive line. But to anyone in that room who knew what to look for, to anyone who had ever studied the true art of combat, the transformation was instantaneous. And it was frightening. Sarah Chen, the sports psychology student, felt a genuine professional chill run down her spine. During her 2 years of studying sports biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of high-definition footage of the world's greatest fighters, from Muhammad Ali to Anderson Silva. What she had just witnessed, in person, was the instantaneous, almost magical, transition from the posture of an ordinary civilian man to that of a born and highly trained predator. It was a change as subtle and as devastating as a shark shifting from a slow, lazy cruise to a high-speed predatory attack. "Interesting," Derek muttered, his own confidence now visibly wavering for the first time. There was something about the way James was now occupying the space, the sheer, unadulterated, and terrifying confidence that was radiating from him, that was awakening all of his most basic, most primitive instincts for self-preservation. James took a single, slow, deliberate step forward, and Derek, without even thinking, instinctively took a step back. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, so utterly revealing, that several of the students in the room gasped. A black belt, a sensei backing away from a janitor. The power dynamic in the room, which had been so clear, so rigid, just a few minutes before, had now completely and irrevocably shifted. Problem? James asked softly, his voice carrying a quiet, profound authority that silenced every other sound in the room. Derek felt the hot, shameful blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation, his authority, his very identity as the master of this dojo was being questioned, was being dismantled, in front of his own students. He couldn't back down now, not now, even though every single, screaming fiber of his being was telling him to stop, to apologize, to run. No problem, Derek replied, forcing a weak, unconvincing smile. Just admiring your posture. Did someone teach you that on YouTube? The joke fell completely flat. No one laughed. The tension in the room had become almost palpable, a thick, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable thing actually. James said calmly, his voice now a low, resonant rumble. I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gymnasium, maybe. You've heard of it? Derek frowned, the name sounding vaguely familiar, but he couldn't quite place the reference. Las Vegas, he scoffed, trying to regain some semblance of his former, arrogant swagger. What kind of weekend boot camp did you do there, Tabo, with Billy Blanks? Sarah Chen, her hands now trembling slightly, had discreetly pulled her phone out of her pocket. She quickly, silently, typed Las Vegas National Gymnasium Martial Arts into the search bar, and what she found, in the first 3 results, made her blood run cold. This wasn't just some prep course. It wasn't some weekend boot camp. It was a legendary, almost mythical, institution. It was the place where the world's greatest MMA champions, the legends of the sport for the last 3 decades, had trained. Derek, James continued, his voice still impossibly, unnervingly calm. I'm going to give you one last chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak her mind. Apologize to your students for turning this place of learning into a circus of your own ego. And most of all, he added, his voice now full of a quiet, sad wisdom, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of person that the true art of martial arts is supposed to teach you not to be. The offer of clemency, of a way out, of a chance to preserve some small, tattered shred of his dignity, hung in the air like a life raft in a stormy sea. Derek could have chosen humility. He could have acknowledged that he had crossed a line. He could have, in that moment, become a real teacher, a real sensei, by demonstrating the courage to admit his own failings. Instead, he chose to attack. Derek's first punch was, from a purely technical standpoint, perfect. It was a fast, accurate, powerful jab, executed exactly as he had learned in the manuals, exactly as he had practiced 10,000 times on the heavy bag. It was the kind of punch that had worked, with devastating efficiency, against 90% of the people he had ever sparred with over the years. But James Washington was not in the 99%. The movement was so fast, so fluid, so utterly, impossibly, economical, that half of the people in the room couldn't even process what had just happened. James simply wasn't there. He wasn't where Derek's fist had been aimed. His body, without any wasted motion, without any sign of effort, had simply slid to the side, like water flowing around a rock. And suddenly, Derek was completely, dangerously, off balance, his arm extended into thin air, his body overcommitted, his defenses completely and utterly down. Nice try, James commented softly, his voice a calm, clinical analysis. He was already repositioned, perfectly balanced, his feet planted firmly on the mat. Clean technique, adequate speed, but you telegraphed the move with your right shoulder, a full half-second before you even started to throw the punch. Derek spun wildly, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a dawning, terrifying disbelief. How had someone moved so fast, so effortlessly? Beginner's luck, he muttered, more to himself than to James, a desperate, pathetic attempt to rationalize the impossible. The second attack came in a quick, angry succession, a jab, a straight right, and a powerful, looping left hook. 3 punches, linked together with the practiced, fluid precision of someone who had drilled the combination thousands upon thousands of times. It was his favorite sequence, his signature move, the one he used to finish sparring sessions and to impress the new wide-eyed beginners. And again, James simply wasn't there. This time, Sarah, her mind now working in a state of highlight professional fascination, managed to follow the movement. James had lowered himself slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible, dipping motion, allowing the jab to pass harmlessly over his head by a matter of inches. The straight right punch had found only empty air when he had leaned back, his body forming an impossible gravity-defying curve. And when Derek had thrown the powerful, looping hook with all of his strength, all of his frustration, all of his rage, James had taken a single, small, precise step back, causing the fist to pass with a soft whooshing sound, just millimeters from his chin. An interesting combination, James observed, his breathing still even, his voice still calm. It probably works well against people who stand still, but you're leaving your entire left side completely and dangerously exposed. After you throw the hook, Derek was starting to sweat now, his chest heaving, his confidence, his arrogance, his entire sense of self, beginning to unravel. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. He had landed thousands upon thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't land a single, solitary one on a man who had, just a few minutes ago, been mopping the floor. A man who had, by his own admission, never fought before. "Stop dancing and fight me," Derek shouted, his voice a raw, desperate, and deeply revealing cry. He launched himself forward in an even more aggressive, and even more reckless sequence of attacks, and that was when James decided that the demonstration, the lesson, had gone on for long enough. Derek's third attack, a wild, desperate combination of punches and kicks, found only empty air once again. But this time, something different happened. When Derek recovered his balance after missing all of his blows, he found that James was inexplicably closer to him, much closer. "How?" Derek whispered, the single word a statement of pure, unadulterated, and terrifying disbelief. He had been the one moving forward, the one attacking, yet James, without any apparent effort, had completely and utterly closed the distance between them. "Derek," James said softly, his voice now just an arm's length away, a quiet, intimate, and deeply menacing sound. "Do you want to know the real difference between someone who learned how to fight in the safe, predictable world of a gym, and someone who learned how to fight in the brutal, unforgiving world of professional rings?" Before Derek could even begin to form an answer, James did something that defied everything that those present thought they knew about physics, about power, about the art of combat. Without any apparent use of force, without any sudden or aggressive movement, without any wind-up or telegraph, he simply touched him. He placed the palm of his right hand, gently, almost casually, on the center of Derek's chest, and Derek flew. He wasn't pushed. He wasn't knocked down. He was quite literally propelled backwards, as if he had been struck by a powerful, the invisible wave of energy. His feet left the ground. He traveled nearly 2 meters through the air, his body a rag doll in the grip of a force he could not comprehend, and he landed, hard, on his back, with a loud, sickening impact that made everyone in the room gasp. That the silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated, and profound shock. Derek lay on the floor for a few long, stunned seconds, staring up at the fluorescent lights on the ceiling, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. There was no pain, not really, just the memory of an irresistible, and yet somehow gentle, force. The force of a man who was operating on a level of skill, of power, of understanding, that was so completely, so fundamentally, different from anything he had ever known, or could ever have imagined. That's impossible," Derek muttered, as he struggled to sit up, his own body feeling strangely disconnected, as if it belonged to someone else. Sarah Chen had stopped breathing. In her 2 years of studying the biomechanics of martial arts, she had never, ever, witnessed such a controlled, and yet so utterly devastating display of power. There had been no brutality in the movement. There had been no anger. There had been only the cold, clinical, and beautiful application of a technique that she had only ever read about in the legends, in the myths, of the great, long-dead masters. "Actually," James said calmly, as he walked over and extended a hand to help Derek to his feet, "it's quite simple. Once you understand the principles of leverage, of timing, and of energy transfer, principles that I learned and perfected over the course of a 22-year professional career." Derek ignored the outstretched hand and scrambled to his feet on his own, his legs still shaking, his mind still reeling. Professional career," he stammered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, horrifying suspicion. "In what?" And it was Sarah who answered, her own voice, now a quiet, awestruck whisper. You don't understand who he is, do you, sensei? Everyone in the room turned to look at her. She was still holding her cell phone, the screen glowing with the results of her quick and life-altering search. On the screen there were dozens of articles, of photographs, of old grainy fight videos, all of them confirming what her own instincts, her own professional training, had already begun to realize. James Washington, she read aloud, her voice trembling slightly, also known as Silent Storm Washington, 5-time, undefeated, world mixed martial arts champion, considered by many experts to be one of the greatest, most technically brilliant fighters in the history of the sport. Retired, undefeated, at the age of 29, after a 22-year professional career. Following, she paused, her eyes widening as she read the final, tragic detail. Following an accident that resulted in the death of his main training partner, the impact of the words of the revelation hit the room like a bomb. Derek felt his face go completely, deathly pale as the full, crushing, and horrifying reality of the situation finally set in. He had not just challenged a janitor, he had challenged a living, breathing, martial arts legend. He had publicly and cruelly humiliated a man who could have, at any moment, with a single, casual, and completely effortless move, knocked him unconscious, or worse. 5 world champion. Derek stammered, all of his arrogance, all of his pride, all of his self-worth, evaporating in an instant, leaving behind only a raw, naked, and deeply pathetic fear. James nodded silently. I retired at 29, he said, his voice quiet, devoid of any triumph. Since then, I've been working whatever jobs I can find, cleaning, maintenance, simple jobs, a simple life, no spotlights, no cameras, no need to prove anything, to anyone. The transformation in Derek was instantaneous, and it was painful to watch. The arrogant, preening sensei was gone, replaced by a small, broken man who finally, and truly, understood the full, crushing magnitude of his own ignorance. I didn't know, Derek whispered, his voice a raw, choked sound. If I had known, if you had known, would you have treated me with respect? James interrupted gently, his voice now full of a quiet, sad wisdom. Yes, but would you still have humiliated some other janitor, some other worker, someone who didn't have the credentials, the history, to defend himself? The question, so simple, so direct, cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. Derek realized, with a sickening, profound clarity, that James had put his finger on the very root of his real, and ugly, problem. It was not his ignorance about James's credentials. It was the fundamental, spiritual arrogance that had made him believe that he had the right to humiliate people, to judge them, based on their professions, on their appearances, on their perceived station in life. Sarah stepped forward, her own voice now firm, confident. Sensei Derek, she said, for 2 years I have trained at this academy. I have respected your experience. But what I witnessed here tonight, that was not teaching, that was bullying. Bullying disguised as instruction. Several of the other students, emboldened by her courage, and by the shocking, world-altering revelation about James, began to murmur in agreement. The entire foundation of their respect for their teacher, for their sensei, had been completely and irrevocably shattered. James, Derek said finally, his voice now laden with a new and deeply unfamiliar humility, a humility that no one in that room had ever heard from him before. I sincerely apologize. To you, to Sarah, to everyone here, I have no excuse for my behavior. None at all. James nodded, accepting the apology with the same quiet, profound grace with which he had mastered the physical confrontation. I appreciate that, Derek, he said, but an apology is only the first step. The real question is, what are you going to do differently from now on? Derek looked around the room, at the faces of his students. He saw them with new eyes. Now, he saw the disappointment in some of their faces. He saw the quiet contempt in others. He saw that he had, in the space of a few short, arrogant minutes, lost something that had taken him years to build. Their trust, their respect. I'll change, Derek promised, his voice a raw, earnest whisper. It will take time, but I will change. And that was when Sarah asked a question that surprised everyone, including James himself. Mr. Washington, she said, her voice full of a new, profound respect, would you ever consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true strength always comes with true responsibility. James smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile that anyone had seen from him that night. Maybe, he said, his eyes thoughtful, but not to teach people how to fight. to teach them something much more important. That respect isn't earned with belts or with titles, it's earned with character. As Derek Mitchell stood in the center of his own dojo, fully and painfully absorbing the most humiliating and most important lesson of his entire life, one final question hung in the quiet, transformed air of the gym. Would one night of profound, soul-crushing humility be enough to truly transform decades of ingrained arrogance? Or would an even deeper, more fundamental change be necessary for true and lasting justice to be served? 3 months later, the Mitchell Modern Martial Arts Academy was a completely and unrecognizably transformed place. James Washington was no longer just the janitor. After a long, soul-searching conversation with the gym's owner, and with the strong and very public endorsement of Sarah Chen and a majority of the other students, he had been hired as a new senior instructor. He did not teach the regular classes. He specialized in advanced techniques and, more importantly, in the philosophy of martial arts. Derek Mitchell, to his credit, had not been fired, but he had lost more than half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video that Sarah had, discreetly and anonymously, recorded of the demonstration had, as she had known it would, spread like wildfire across social media and through the tight-knit and often unforgiving martial arts community. The story of the arrogant, black belt sensei who had been so effortlessly, so completely humiliated by a man he had thought was a simple janitor had become a legend, a cautionary tale. Derek's reputation, in the wider world of martial arts, was ruined. But in the small, transformed world of his own gym, he was slowly and painfully beginning to rebuild it. He continued to teach the beginner and intermediate classes, but now with a new and deeply unfamiliar humility, a humility that had been forced upon him by a profound and very public shame. He was, in a very real sense, learning alongside his students. Sensei James, Sarah said, after one of his classes on the principles of respect and humility in the Thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed, doesn't need to be shouted, to be recognized. James smiled, as he calmly, methodically, organized the training equipment. The best, and only, lesson I can teach you, Sarah, he said, is a very simple one. Never ever judge a person by their profession or by their appearance. Everyone, every single person, carries stories and strengths and sorrows that can and will surprise you. Sometimes, James had learned, justice comes not with a bang, but with a whisper. It comes quietly, like a silent storm, a storm that transforms everything in its path, without ever making a sound. James had proven, to himself, and to the small world of that gym, that the best, most profound revenge is not in destroying your opponent, it is in showing them, and the world, that true and lasting greatness comes not from titles, not from belts, not from a position of power, it comes from character. If this story, a story of a quiet, hidden strength, of a profound and unexpected victory, has touched your heart, then subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to discover more stories about the extraordinary, and often invisible, people who, in their own quiet and powerful ways, turn their greatest humiliations into their most triumphant and most meaningful victories.